My name is Renata Holloway. I'm 38 years old. I run the paternity and prenatal genetics division of a diagnostics laboratory that processes 12,000 DNA samples a year. And I was 7 months pregnant, sitting in a folding chair under a balloon arch, when my mother-in-law stood up in front of 40 people and said, "This baby isn't even his." The room went the kind of quiet that has a sound to it. I held breath multiplied by 40 people. I didn't move. I'd spent 15 years learning how to sit perfectly still while someone else's world came apart across a lab counter from me. I didn't know yet that this time, the world coming apart was mine. My husband, Daniel, was 3 feet away holding a plate of petit fours. He set the plate down so slowly and so precisely that I remember thinking, in the strange sideways way your mind works during a crisis, that he'd never once been that careful with a plate in 11 years of marriage. Then he stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look at me first. He looked at his mother, and he said one sentence that I will hear for the rest of my life: "Say that again, and mean it, because I'm going to need you to prove it." That sentence is where this story actually starts. Everything before it is just the fuse. Welcome back to Gia Mom Stories, where mothers share the moments that tried to break them and the quiet, methodical strength that put everything back together. If you've ever been accused of something you didn't do by someone who was supposed to love you, stay with me to the end. Subscribe, drop a comment, and let's begin. Renata Holloway, Laboratory Director, Meridian Diagnostics, Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Population 11,000. One regional lab, and I run it. 15 years in molecular genetics. Before that, for years at a state crime lab doing forensic DNA work, and before that, a biology degree from Penn State that I paid for by working the overnight shift at a blood bank so I could study between draws. I didn't grow up around science. My father drove a delivery truck for a beverage distributor. My mother did alterations out of our garage, the same way some women do dishes: constant, unglamorous, necessary. I was the first person in my family to go to college. I chose genetics because in 8th grade a substitute teacher explained that every cell in your body carries a complete, unchangeable record of exactly who your parents are, and I thought, that's the only kind of proof I've ever trusted. Not stories people tell. Not who yells the loudest. A record that doesn't change depending on who's in the room. At Meridian, I oversee 2 departments. Forensic and legal paternity testing, the kind used in custody disputes, immigration cases, inheritance disputes, and prenatal genetics, which includes non-invasive prenatal paternity testing, a blood draw from the mother that isolates fetal DNA circulating in her own bloodstream and compares it against a potential father's cheek swab. No needle near the baby. Just tubes, chain of custody forms, and math so precise it doesn't leave room for opinions. People think my job is boring. They picture a woman in a white coat squinting at gels. What they don't understand is that I spend my days holding the thing people fight hardest and dirtiest over, the truth about who belongs to whom, and I have learned that almost nobody who lies about paternity does it by accident. They do it because the truth costs them something. Money. Reputation. Power. I've watched grown men refuse to test their own children because as long as the question stays open, so does their exit. I've watched women forge results to keep child support flowing to the wrong man. In 15 years and roughly 11,000 cases, I have learned exactly one thing above all others: when someone is loud about paternity before they have proof, they are not confused. They are working an angle. I should have remembered that the night I got engaged. I didn't, because it's harder to see an angle when the person working it is smiling at your wedding. Daniel Whitfield, 40 years old when this happened, project manager at Whitfield Construction and Development, a company his late father built from a two-man framing crew in 1979 into the largest residential contractor in 3 counties. Daniel is steady in a way that used to be rare in the men I dated, the kind of steady where he shows up on time, tells you the bad news the same day he learns it, and doesn't need to be the loudest person in a room to matter in it. We met when his company partnered with the hospital foundation on a fundraiser, and I was seated next to him at a table of strangers. He asked what I did for a living, and when I told him, most men either glaze over or make a joke about paternity tests. Daniel asked how non-invasive testing actually worked, cell-free DNA fragmentation and all, and I fell for him somewhere around the third follow-up question. We married 4 years ago. Small ceremony, 60 guests, at a vineyard 40 minutes outside Millbrook. His mother, Vivian Whitfield, gave a toast that I remember word for word because of how carefully it avoided saying anything warm about me specifically. To Daniel, she said, glass raised, eyes on her son, who has always known exactly what he wants. Not a word about me. I told myself it was just Vivian's way. I would learn, eventually, that with Vivian, there is no just. Vivian Whitfield is 66 years old, and since her husband Harold died 6 years ago, she has run Whitfield Construction as majority owner, 60% of the company, with the remaining 40% split between Daniel and his older sister, Kimberly. Vivian built her authority the way some women build a garden, patiently, with a plan for every season, and with absolute intolerance for weeds. She sits on the boards of 2 local charities. She hosts a holiday party every December that half the town treats as a status marker. You know you've arrived in Millbrook when Vivian Whitfield puts you on the list. She has never once, in 4 years, called me by a nickname. Always Renata. Full name every time, like she was reading it off a chart. Kimberly Whitfield Ross is Daniel's older sister, 43, married to a man named Peter who lost his sales job 18 months before any of this happened and hadn't found steady work since. They have 1 son, Tyler, 16. Kimberly works part-time doing the company's marketing, a role Vivian created for her more out of family obligation than business necessity, and everyone in the family knew it, including Kimberly. I liked Kimberly, early on. She was funny in a sharp, sideways way, and she was the only person in the Whitfield family who ever asked me questions about my work that weren't really about her. Kimberly had grown up, like Daniel, inside Vivian's particular version of family loyalty, the kind measured in usefulness rather than warmth. She'd gone to college for marketing, married young, and spent a decade believing Peter's sales career would eventually give her the kind of stability her mother respected. When Peter's company restructured and let him go 18 months before the shower, Kimberly told almost no one outside her own household for the first year, partly out of pride and partly, I'd come to understand, out of fear that admitting the trouble out loud would make Vivian start asking questions about the marketing role at Whitfield Construction that Kimberly herself knew was more courtesy than necessity. Every quarter that passed without a real job for Peter tightened something in Kimberly that had nothing to do with me at all, and everything to do with a woman watching the one soft place in her life, her son's future, start to look, in her own mind, like the only thing left she could still control. I didn't know, that first year, that Kimberly was 3 payments behind on a home equity loan she'd taken out against a house that was already worth less than she owed. I didn't know that Peter's unemployment checks had run out 14 months before the baby shower. I didn't know that the Whitfield Family Trust, the one that would eventually distribute the 60% of the company Vivian controlled, was structured to split evenly among Vivian's grandchildren once she passed, per stirpes, meaning each branch of the family got an equal share regardless of how many children were in it. Daniel and I had no children yet. Kimberly had 1. If Daniel and I never had a child, Tyler would eventually inherit half of everything meant to be split 3 ways. If Daniel and I had a baby, that baby would take an equal third share, and Tyler's eventual portion would shrink by exactly that much. I want to be clear that I didn't understand any of this the night my mother-in-law stood up at my baby shower and called my son a lie. I didn't understand the math until much later, when understanding the math became my job. But I want you to have it now, because once you have it, you'll see the whole shape of what happened before I did. I want you to understand what 15 years in that lab actually teaches a person, because it matters for everything that comes after. Early in my career, at the state crime lab, I worked a paternity dispute tied to a contested estate. A man had died leaving a modest life insurance policy, and two women both claimed the child in question was his. I ran the panel 3 times before I trusted the result, because the family on the losing side was already threatening to sue the lab, sue me personally, sue anyone who'd signed their name to a piece of paper that cost them money. I learned that day that the truth is never the expensive part of a case. Defending it against people who don't want it to be true, that's the expensive part. I carried that lesson with me for 15 years without ever imagining I'd need it inside my own dining room. I also learned, over 11,000 cases, how to read a room the way I read a gel, patiently, without assuming the first band I see tells the whole story. People lie to labs constantly. Fathers lie about how many partners a mother had. Mothers lie about certainty they don't actually have. Grandparents, more often than people expect, lie to protect money that hasn't even been inherited yet, arguing paternity to keep an estate intact before anyone has died. I'd seen that particular flavor of lie in other families a dozen times across my career. I had simply never once considered that I might see it in mine, wearing my mother-in-law's face, delivered at my own baby shower. I got pregnant 14 months into trying, which in my field I understood better than most people. I know exactly how many things have to go right for a healthy pregnancy, so I never took a single week of it for granted. Daniel cried in the bathroom when I showed him the test, came out with red eyes, and said, "I don't know why I'm like this," and I said, "I do. You've been waiting longer than you told me." He had. He'd wanted this for 2 years before I knew. Vivian's reaction to the pregnancy news was 3 words. Well. Finally. Not unkind exactly. But not the reaction of a woman who'd been hoping. I noticed it. I noted it the way I note an unusual band pattern on a gel, not proof of anything yet, just a flag. Worth watching. Around month 4, small things started happening that I filed away the same way. Vivian asked, apropos of nothing, at Sunday dinner, whether these days doctors could tell you for certain a baby was full term, or if sometimes a due date gets fudged. I told her due dates are calculated from gestational measurements that are extremely reliable by the 2nd trimester. She said, interesting, and changed the subject. Around month 5, Kimberly began commenting, lightly, at every family gathering, on how busy my work travel had been that year. I'd gone to 2 professional conferences, one in Pittsburgh, one in Baltimore, both of which Daniel knew about, both of which I'd have been happy to put on a public calendar. "You two barely see each other," she said once, smiling, "with your schedule and his hours at the sites." I laughed it off. I told Daniel about it that night, half as a joke. He said, "Kim's just Kim." I let it go. That was my first real mistake, not the not noticing, but the letting go. In my field, you don't get to let go of an anomaly just because it's inconvenient to chase. Around month 6, Vivian asked me, in front of her sister-in-law at a bridal shower for someone else's daughter, what percentage of babies these days weren't biologically related to the man raising them. I told her, honestly, because I know the actual research, that misattributed paternity studies put the rate somewhere between 1 and 10% depending on population and methodology, and that most of it comes down to people not testing rather than people cheating. She nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something for her, and said, "That's a lot higher than I would have guessed." I remember feeling a small, cold drop in my stomach that I didn't examine closely enough at the time. I was 7 months into building a human being. I did not have the bandwidth I should have had for detective work inside my own family. That is, I've come to believe, exactly what Vivian and Kimberly were counting on. The baby shower was held at Vivian's house, because Vivian hosts everything at her house, a colonial on 4 acres outside town with a wraparound porch and, that day, a backyard full of white folding chairs and a dessert table with more petit fours than seemed medically reasonable. 40 guests. My mother flew in from Ohio. My best friend from graduate school, Priya Shah, drove 3 hours because she wouldn't have missed it. Priya is a senior molecular biologist at Meridian, the person who trained under me for 2 years before becoming my closest colleague, and one of exactly 3 people who knew, at that point, every detail of my professional and personal life without a filter between them. I want you to understand what that day was supposed to be. It was supposed to be small talk and finger sandwiches and a diaper raffle and my mother crying a little when I opened the hand-knit sweater she'd made. It was supposed to be, at worst, boring. I was 7 months pregnant, my ankles hurt, and I wanted cake. We were maybe 40 minutes into the gift opening. I'd unwrapped a stroller attachment, a stack of onesies, a set of muslin swaddles from Priya with a card that said for the smartest baby in Millbrook, obviously. Vivian was standing near the dessert table, wine glass in hand. She'd had 2, I'd counted, because counting things is a reflex I don't turn off, and Kimberly was beside her, phone out, the way Kimberly's phone was always out at family events, though I didn't think anything of it at the time. Vivian set her glass down on the dessert table with more force than the moment called for. It made a small, sharp sound against the wood, and a few people looked over out of instinct. "I think," she said, in a voice pitched to Carrie, the way you pitch a voice when you want an audience and not a conversation, "that before this goes any further, this family deserves to know the truth." I remember thinking, in the half-second before she kept talking, that she was about to announce something about the company. A retirement. A restructuring. Something dry and businesslike that Vivian would think important enough to hijack a baby shower for. "This baby," she said, looking directly at me, "isn't even his." 40 people. A held breath multiplied by 40. I have sat across the table from people delivering devastating results my entire career. I have told a 22-year-old man that the child he'd raised for 3 years wasn't biologically his. I have told a mother that the man she'd accused for a decade was, in fact, innocent, and watched a decade of certainty collapse on her face in real time. I know what the first 5 seconds of a life-altering sentence look like on a human face, because I have caused that expression professionally, over and over, with more compassion than Vivian showed me that day. I sat perfectly still. My hands were folded over the shower of tissue paper in my lap. I did not gasp. I did not cry. Somewhere in the crowd, my mother made a small, wounded sound, and I heard Priya's chair scrape back an inch, like she was preparing to stand. Daniel was 3 feet away, holding a plate of petit fours he'd just picked up from the dessert table. He set the plate down. Slowly. Precisely. Like the plate mattered more than anything else in the world for exactly the 2 seconds it took him to put it down without a sound. Then he stood up. He didn't look at me first. He looked at his mother. "Say that again," he said, "and mean it, because I'm going to need you to prove it." Vivian's chin lifted a fraction. "I have proof, Daniel." "Then you'll show it to me," he said. "Not to 40 people at a baby shower. To me. Tonight." I want to tell you that I felt grateful in that moment, and I did, but gratitude wasn't the loudest thing in me. The loudest thing in me was a kind of cold, professional clarity I recognized from work, the feeling I get when a result comes back ambiguous and I know, before I even open the file, that I am about to spend the next several weeks running down every thread until there's nothing left ambiguous about it. Kimberly's phone was still in her hand. She wasn't filming, I checked, later, in my memory, frame by frame, the way I'd learned to review evidence, but she was watching the room the way you watch a room when you already know how the scene ends. I stood up. 7 months pregnant, ankle swollen, 40 people staring. I picked up my purse from the folding chair beside me. I looked at Vivian, and I used the voice I use when I deliver a result I already know the person doesn't want to hear, steady, clear, no heat in it, because heat is what people expect and heat is what lets them make you the villain of your own vindication. I'll take that test today, Vivian, I said. Today. Not through you. Through an independent lab, with a chain of custody you can't touch, and I'll have Daniel's results back before this baby is born. And when it comes back exactly the way I already know it will, I want you to think very carefully about what you'll say to make up for this. I walked out with my mother on one arm and Priya on the other. Daniel stayed behind for exactly 4 minutes, I know because I looked at the clock in the car, and when he got in beside us, his jaw was tight in a way I'd never seen on him before. She's not staying under my roof for Christmas this year, he said. I don't care what she says next. I didn't answer him right away. I was already doing the thing I do best. I was building a case file in my head. Not against my husband, I never doubted Daniel, and I want to be honest that this story is not a story about whether my husband was the father of my child. I knew he was. I've known things with more certainty in my life, and paternity of my own son was not one of the uncertain ones. This story is about who benefits when a family believes a lie, and how far 2 people will go to make sure they do. Stay with me. Because the test result was never the hard part. Finding out why Vivian said it, and proving it in a way nobody in that family could argue with, that was the hard part. I want to walk you through the next several weeks the way I would walk a jury through evidence, because that's exactly how I approached it. In my field, you don't confront a result with emotion. You confront it with documentation. Every date, every source, every number traceable back to something real. The morning after the shower, I called Dr. Amelia Sato, an OB/GYN colleague at a different hospital system 40 minutes from Millbrook, someone I'd worked with professionally for years but who had zero social connection to the Whitfield family. I told her I needed a non-invasive prenatal paternity test done through her office, using an outside accredited lab, not Meridian, because I run Meridian, and I will not let anyone say the results of my own son's paternity test came from a lab I control. I wanted this done in a way that could survive any level of scrutiny. Dr. Sato drew my blood that same afternoon. Daniel gave a buccal swab in front of a witness, a notary, the same day. Chain of custody documented start to finish, sealed sample bags, signatures, timestamps, a shipping label to an accredited independent laboratory in Philadelphia that neither Daniel nor I had ever used before and that had no professional relationship with Meridian. I know exactly how these tests can be challenged in court, because I've testified about chain of custody more times than I can count, and I built this one so there wasn't a single link anyone could pull on. Then I did something I hadn't told Daniel I was going to do. I started asking questions. I called my sister-in-law Kimberly first, 3 days after the shower, and asked her, casually, over coffee at a diner on Route 9, where her mother had gotten the idea that my baby wasn't Daniel's. Kimberly stirred her coffee for a long time before she answered. Mom's been worried, she said. You know how she is. She noticed things. What things, Kimberly? The conferences. The late nights. She said you two barely see each other some months. Kimberly wouldn't meet my eyes when she said it, and in 15 years of reading test results and reading the people who come to collect them, I have learned that the eyes tell you more than the mouth does. I asked her directly, did you tell her anything specific? A date, a place, anything you actually saw? Kimberly's coffee cup made a small sound against the saucer. I didn't see anything, Ren. I would never, she stopped herself. Mom just gets ideas. I wrote the conversation down that night, word for word, the way I'd write down a witness statement. Not because I distrusted my memory. Because I've learned that memory drifts, and documentation doesn't. 2 weeks later, I got the piece I hadn't known I was looking for. My mother-in-law's longtime housekeeper, a woman named Dolores who had worked for the Whitfield family for 11 years and who had always been quietly, genuinely kind to me, the kind of kindness that doesn't announce itself, called me on a Tuesday evening. She said she'd been turning something over in her mind for 2 weeks and couldn't sit on it anymore. Dolores told me that 6 weeks before the baby shower, she'd overheard Kimberly and Vivian in the kitchen, and Kimberly had said something Dolores hadn't understood at the time but couldn't stop thinking about since. If she has a boy, that's it, Mom. That's half of Tyler's future gone. You have to do something before that baby's born. I asked Dolores if she'd be willing to write that down and sign it, date it. She said yes without hesitation. I've watched you be nothing but good to that family, she told me. I'm not going to watch them do this to you and say nothing. I want to pause here, because this is the moment the shape of the whole thing became visible to me, not a rumor born out of genuine suspicion, but a strategy born out of arithmetic. I went home that night and pulled up the language of the Whitfield Family Trust, which Daniel had a copy of in our home filing cabinet from an estate planning meeting years earlier, the kind of document neither of us had ever read closely because neither of us had ever needed to. Per Sturpey's distribution. Vivian's 60% of Whitfield construction, upon her death, would be divided by branch, Daniel's branch and Kimberly's branch, each getting 30% of the company, then subdivided equally among however many grandchildren existed in that branch. Right now, Tyler was the only grandchild in the entire family. If my baby was never born, or if my baby's legitimacy could be successfully challenged and the child excluded from the family line in any legal or practical sense, Tyler's eventual share stayed enormous, 30% of a construction company worth, by Daniel's own estimate, north of $11 million. If my baby was recognized as Daniel's child, Tyler's eventual 30% got cut in half to make room for a cousin. Roughly $2 million, by Daniel's rough math, moving from Tyler's future to my son's. I am not a lawyer. I am not an inheritance strategist. But I have spent 15 years learning that when you follow the money in a family dispute, you almost always find the actual argument underneath the argument people are willing to say out loud. Nobody stands up at a baby shower and says, I want to protect my grandson's inheritance. They say, this baby isn't even his. One sentence is honest and unsayable. The other is a lie you can say in front of 40 people and still get invited to Thanksgiving. Before I called Priya, I did something smaller, almost instinctive. I pulled my own phone records for the 8 months leading up to the shower and laid them next to my work travel calendar, conference by conference, hotel by hotel, the way I'd lay out a chain of custody log for a legal case. I wanted, more than anything, to be able to say with total certainty where I had been on every date that could possibly matter, before anyone else got the chance to tell that story for me. It took an evening. Every night matched exactly what I remembered. Pittsburgh, the Marriott off Grant Street, checked in with Priya, checked out 2 days later. Baltimore, a hotel near the harbor, 3 nights, a conference badge with my photo on it in a drawer in my office to this day. There was no gap in that calendar wide enough to drive a rumor through. I hadn't needed to build that alibi. I built it anyway, because in my work you never present a conclusion without first ruling out every alternative yourself, before someone else tries to rule it out for you in public. I called Priya that night. Priya had been asking me daily how I was holding up, and I finally told her everything: the trust, Dolores, Kimberly's coffee shop non-denial. Priya, who has run more forensic paternity cases with me than I can count, said the thing I needed someone else to say out loud before I fully believed it myself. Ren. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a plan. And plans leave paper trails, because people who plan things are usually too confident to be careful. She was right. And the paper trail, when I finally found it, was uglier than either of us expected. For weeks after the shower, still waiting on the paternity results, labs like the one I'd chosen typically run 5 to 7 business days, but I wanted this one triple verified before I ever spoke a word of the result to anyone, so I'd asked for confirmatory retesting on a second draw, which added time. Kimberly made a mistake. She made the same mistake almost everyone makes, in my professional experience: when they'd built a lie that's held up so far, she got confident. Daniel came home one evening and told me his mother had shown him proof. Not that day at the shower, she'd had nothing that day, which I already knew, because a woman with actual proof doesn't need to shout it across a dessert table, she takes it to a lawyer. But 4 weeks later, cornered by Daniel's repeated, calm insistence that she produce whatever she claimed to have, Vivian handed her son a printed photograph. It showed me, or a woman who looked remarkably like me from behind, same haircut, same build, wearing a coat I did own, standing close to a man outside a motel on Route 22, roughly 90 minutes from Millbrook, on a date that corresponded to one of my conference trips to Pittsburgh 8 months earlier. Vivian also handed him 2 printed text message screenshots, supposedly from my phone, arranging to meet at the usual place. Daniel brought all of it home and put it on our kitchen table without a word, watching my face while I looked at it. Here is the thing about spending 15 years analyzing evidence for a living: bad forgeries announce themselves to a trained eye almost immediately. The same way a bad stitch announces itself to a tailor or a fake invoice announces itself to a pharmacist who's filled 11,000 real ones. I picked up the photograph first. The lighting on my supposed face didn't match the lighting on the motel sign behind me. The sign was lit by late afternoon sun from the west, and the shadow falling across my face came from the east. I picked up the text screenshots next. The font kerning in the message bubbles was subtly, almost invisibly, different from Apple's native messaging font, the kind of difference you'd never catch unless you'd spent years reading digital evidence for a living, but once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And the phone status bar showed a battery icon styled at my phone, an iPhone running an operating system I'd updated 11 months earlier, hadn't used in over a year. I called Priya that night and asked her to bring her laptop and her actual forensic image analysis software, the kind we sometimes use in legal cases when a client submits digital evidence for a paternity or fraud dispute. She came over within the hour. We spent 4 hours at my kitchen table. Priya pulled the metadata from the photograph. Vivian had sent Daniel a printed copy, but Daniel had also, smartly, asked his mother to text him the digital file, and Priya extracted the EXIF data before it could be stripped by any further compression. The file's creation date was 11 days before the baby shower, not 8 months earlier when the alleged affair photo was supposedly taken. The image had been created, according to its own embedded data, using an editing application, not a camera. Someone had built that photograph. Not caught it. Built it. The text screenshots were worse, once Priya got into them. She ran a font and rendering analysis that showed the message bubbles had been composited from a screenshot template widely available online, the kind people use to fake texts for pranks or, apparently, for something much less funny. The phone number displayed at the top of the fake thread wasn't even my actual number, it was off by 2 digits, a detail so small that Vivian and Kimberly had clearly assumed no one would ever check, because why would a grieving daughter-in-law cross-reference a forged phone number against her actual phone bill? I did. I pulled up my carrier statement from that exact night and put it next to the fake screenshot. 2 digits off. That was the moment I stopped feeling hurt and started feeling something closer to what I feel at work when a case finally clicks into focus, a kind of grim, quiet momentum. I called Dolores again the next morning and asked whether she knew who Kimberly had been getting help from, because building a convincing forged photograph and doctored text thread isn't something most people do alone at a kitchen table. Dolores said she'd overheard Kimberly on the phone with someone named Wade more than once in the weeks before the shower. A little searching, the kind any diligent person could do, not anything requiring my professional tools, turned up Wade Pruitt, a former high school classmate of Kimberly's who ran a small graphic design and photo retouching business out of his home, 40 minutes outside Millbrook. His public business page showed exactly the kind of composite and retouching work that would produce what I was looking at. I didn't confront Wade. That wasn't my job, and I wanted the whole picture complete before anyone outside my small circle knew how much I already had. Instead, I called Daniel's family attorney directly, a woman named Grace Feldman, who had drafted the Whitfield Trust years earlier and who Daniel trusted completely, in part because she'd been fair to both Daniel and Kimberly during their father's estate settlement. I told Grace everything. The trust math. Kimberly's comment to Vivian in the kitchen, as reported by Dolores. The forged photograph with its 11-day-old creation date. The doctored texts with the wrong phone number. Grace listened without interrupting for nearly 20 minutes, and when she finally spoke, she said something I've thought about often since. Renata, I've drafted a lot of trusts in this town, and I've watched a lot of families fight over them. I have never once seen someone try to manufacture evidence of infidelity to protect an inheritance. That's not a family dispute. That's fraud, and depending on how it's used, it could be defamation, forgery, or both. I asked her what I should do with that. Document everything you have, she said. Timeline it. And when you're ready, I want to be in the room when you present it. That became my project for the next 3 weeks, alongside waiting for the paternity results and preparing for a baby who, forged photographs notwithstanding, was still due in 9 weeks and did not care one bit about his family's financial disputes. I built the case file the same way I build every case file at work. A summary page on top, tabs behind it, every claim sourced back to a document, a date, or a verified statement. I typed it up at my kitchen table over 3 nights while Daniel held my feet, which had started swelling by then, and read pages over my shoulder without saying much, his jaw tightening a little more with each new tab. Tab 1, the non-invasive prenatal paternity test, both draws, both confirmed, chain of custody documentation from Dr. Sato's office through to the independent Philadelphia lab, probability of paternity 99.99997%, Daniel Whitfield identified as the biological father. That result had come back 9 days after the shower, and I had made Daniel and myself sit on it privately for weeks, not because I doubted it for a second, but because I wanted it to land at the end of the story, not the beginning. A result revealed too early lets people quietly walk back their accusation without ever answering for why they made it. I wanted Vivian and Kimberly to answer for the why. Tab 2, the family trust language, per Sturpey's distribution, with Grace Feldman's plain English summary of exactly how much money moved from Tyler's eventual share to my son's depending on whether my pregnancy was publicly discredited. Tab 3, Dolores's signed, dated statement about the kitchen conversation 6 weeks before the shower. If she has a boy, that's it, Mom. That's half of Tyler's future gone. Tab 4, the forged photograph, printed beside Priya's metadata extraction showing the file's true creation date, 11 days before the shower, built in an editing application, not captured by a camera. Tab 5, the doctored text message screenshots, printed beside Priya's font and rendering analysis, and my actual phone bill showing the real number, 2 digits different from the fabricated thread. Tab 6, Wade Pruitt's public business page, showing the exact style of photo compositing work matching what had been done to the motel photograph, and Dolores's account of Kimberly's phone calls to him in the weeks leading up to the shower. Tab 7, the one I added last, the financial motive laid bare in plain numbers, Kimberly and Peter's mortgage default notice, which Grace was able to confirm existed through public county filing records, dated 4 months before the shower. 14 months of no steady income from Peter. A home equity loan 3 payments behind. People don't forge affair evidence for fun. They do it because they're drowning, and somebody else's inheritance looks like a life raft. 41 pages total, tabbed, dated, sourced. I'd built 200 paternity case files in my career that mattered less than this one. I want to tell you honestly that there was a night, about 2 weeks before I was ready to present any of it, where I sat alone in the nursery we'd half finished, a crib assembled, no mattress yet, paint samples still taped to the wall, and I cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry at the shower or in any of the weeks since. Not because I doubted the outcome. Because I understood, fully, for the first time, that the 2 women who had done this weren't strangers. One of them had toasted my wedding. One of them had sent me a card that said for the smartest baby in Millbrook. Evidence doesn't hurt any less just because you can explain it. It just means you know exactly how much it's going to cost the people who made it. Then I wiped my face, went back to the kitchen table, and finished tab 7. I called Grace the next morning and told her I was ready. She suggested a family meeting rather than another public event, controlled, documented, with witnesses who mattered rather than an audience who'd just gossip. Daniel wanted his mother and sister to come to our house. I agreed, on one condition: Grace would be present as legal witness, and Priya would be present as the scientific witness who could speak to the forensic analysis in terms nobody could argue with, because nobody argues with the person who actually ran the software. Daniel called his mother himself. He told her only that we had the test results and that the family needed to meet, at our house, the following Sunday, with our attorney present. I heard him on the phone from the next room, his voice level in a way I knew was costing him effort. "You're going to want to be there, Mom. And you're going to want to bring Kimberly." Vivian tried, predictably, to push the meeting to her house instead, the same instinct, I think, that made her choose the baby shower as her stage in the first place, a woman who does her best performing on her own turf. Daniel said no. Our house. Our table. Our rules, this time. Sunday came. I set the dining room table the way I set an evidence table at work, not a single object out of place, nothing there by accident. Water glasses at each seat, because I wanted this to feel formal without feeling like a meal, since nobody in that room was going to have an appetite. The 41-page case file sat in the center of the table, closed, next to my laptop with Priya's forensic analysis software already open and ready. Grace Feldman arrived first, gray blazer, briefcase, the same calm efficiency she probably brought to every trust dispute she'd ever handled. She sat to my right. Priya arrived 10 minutes later, laptop bag over her shoulder, and sat to my left, and squeezed my hand once under the table before letting go. Daniel let his mother and sister in at exactly 2 o'clock. Vivian walked in wearing the same kind of composed, faintly superior expression she wore to everything, a woman who still believed, I think, that she held the upper hand simply because she was the one who'd started this. Kimberly walked in 2 steps behind her, and I noticed immediately that she wouldn't look at me. She hadn't looked at me properly since the diner 3 weeks earlier. They sat across from us. Daniel sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched. "Thank you both for coming," I said, and I used the voice I use at work when I'm about to deliver a result that will change the rest of someone's life. Steady. Clear. No performance in it, because performance was Vivian's tool, not mine. "I'm going to walk through everything I have, once, completely, and then we'll talk about what happens next." I opened the file to the first tab. "On the day of my baby shower," I said, in front of 40 guests, "Vivian, you announced that this baby wasn't Daniel's. I want to start with the only piece of information that actually matters, and then I want to spend the rest of this meeting explaining exactly why you said it anyway." I placed the paternity report on the table, face up, the summary page first. Probability of paternity 99.99997%, Daniel Whitfield identified as the biological father, chain of custody documentation attached beneath it, page after page, notarized signatures, an independent accredited laboratory with no relationship to Meridian or to me. This test was drawn 9 days after the shower, at an outside OB/GYN office, processed by a lab I have never worked with and have no financial or professional connection to, specifically so that no one at this table could ever say the results were mine to control. Daniel is this baby's father. That was never actually in question. It was only ever in question for the 40 people watching you say it. Vivian's mouth opened slightly. Kimberly's hands went still in her lap. "Now," I said, "I want to talk about why you said it." I turned to tab 2, laid the trust summary on the table, and let Grace speak to the numbers, because a hired attorney explaining the math lands differently than a daughter-in-law explaining it. Grace walked through the per stirpe structure in plain, unhurried language, how Tyler's eventual share had, until my pregnancy, represented the entirety of one branch of the family, and how a second grandchild would cut that branch's future in half. "Approximately $2 million, Grace said, moving from one grandchild's eventual inheritance to another's, based purely on whether this baby is publicly recognized as Daniel's son." "That's absurd," Kimberly said, finding her voice for the first time. "You think I'd fabricate an affair over money?" I turned to tab 3. Dolores's statement, signed and dated, sat on the table between us. I read it aloud, slowly. "If she has a boy, that's it, Mom. That's half of Tyler's future gone. You have to do something before that baby's born." Spoken in your mother's kitchen, Kimberly, 6 weeks before the shower. Dolores heard it. Dolores wrote it down. Dolores signed it. Kimberly's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. Vivian's hand found the edge of the table. "That woman has always exaggerated," Vivian said, but her voice had lost its earlier certainty. "Then let's move to tab 4, I said, because Dolores's memory isn't the part of this you're going to have trouble arguing with." I laid the forged photograph on the table, and beside it, Priya's printed metadata report. Priya leaned forward and spoke for the first time, her voice calm and technical in the specific way that makes people stop interrupting. "This file's embedded creation data shows it was generated 11 days before the baby shower, using photo editing software, not captured by a camera at any point 8 months ago. The lighting on the subject's face doesn't match the lighting on the motel signage behind her, 2 different light sources composited together. This image was built. It wasn't found." Vivian stared at the photograph like it might rearrange itself into something less damning if she looked long enough. "Tab 5, I said, and laid the fake text screenshots beside Priya's font analysis and my actual phone carrier statement. The message bubbles were built from a publicly available screenshot template. The phone number displayed at the top of this thread is 2 digits off from my real number, which you would know, Vivian, if you'd ever actually called me instead of about me. I don't understand technology, Vivian said. I didn't create these. Kimberly brought them to me. Kimberly's head snapped toward her mother. You're going to say that? Right now? Tab 6, I said, before either of them could turn this into a fight I had no interest in refereeing. I laid out Wade Pruitt's business page, his portfolio of composite photo work, and Dolores's account of the phone calls. Kimberly, you reached out to a former classmate who does exactly this kind of digital retouching work, in the weeks before my shower. I'm not asking you to confirm it. The pattern confirms itself. Kimberly said nothing. Her jaw was tight the way Daniel's had been at the shower, but there was no defiance behind it, only the particular exhaustion of someone who has run out of angles. And tab 7, I said, my voice not rising, not needing to, is the part one understand best, because I understand what it is to be afraid of losing something. Peter's been out of steady work for 14 months. You're 3 payments behind on your home equity loan. You filed for a mortgage default extension 4 months before my shower, which is public record, which Grace confirmed. You didn't do this because you hate me, Kimberly. You did this because you're drowning, and my son looked like $2 million you couldn't afford to lose. The room was silent except for the low hum of our refrigerator in the next room and, somewhere upstairs, the sound of the baby monitor we'd set up early, just to test it, picking up nothing but static. Vivian spoke first, and her voice had changed completely, not the pitched, performative voice from the shower, but something smaller. I didn't ask her to forge anything, Renata. I swear to you, I didn't know the photograph was fake. She showed it to me and I believed it because I wanted, she stopped. Because you wanted it to be true, I finished for her. Because if it were true, your grandson's future stayed twice as large, and you didn't have to look at the math directly. You just had to believe the story that got you there. Vivian didn't answer. That was, I think, the most honest thing she'd done since the day I met her. Daniel spoke then, for the first time since we'd sat down, and his voice was steadier than I expected, though I could feel, through the arm pressed against mine, exactly how much it was costing him. You stood up at my wife's baby shower, he said to his mother, in front of 40 people, and you called my son a lie. You didn't come to me first. You didn't ask a single honest question. You performed an accusation in public because a private one wouldn't have done what you needed it to do, which was humiliate her so badly that maybe she'd leave, or maybe I would, and either way, the math would sort itself out without you ever having to say the word inheritance out loud. Daniel. I'm not finished, he said, and Vivian, for possibly the first time in her adult life, closed her mouth and let her son keep talking. I stood up that day because I trust my wife more than I trust a rumor, Mom. I'm standing up right now because I need you to understand that trusting her wasn't the hard part. The hard part is going to be figuring out whether I can trust you again. Vivian was quiet for a long moment, staring at the phone number discrepancy like she could will it back into matching. I want to see my phone, she said finally, almost to herself. I need to see what she showed me on my own phone. Kimberly didn't move. Daniel slid Vivian's own phone across the table. She'd left it on the counter when she walked in, and Priya had already, with Vivian's earlier permission the week before during a separate call about the meeting logistics, confirmed which messages Kimberly had actually sent her mother. The thread was there in black and white, unedited, unmediated by any printout Kimberly had curated. Vivian scrolled through it herself, slowly, her reading glasses sliding down her nose, and I watched her find the original message where Kimberly had written, Mom, I know this is a lot, but you need to see this before the shower. I didn't want to believe it either. Underneath it, a separate message, sent 4 days earlier, that Vivian apparently hadn't fully registered at the time. Wade says he can have something ready by Thursday. Vivian looked up from the phone. Her face had gone the particular gray of a person watching a story they'd trusted rearrange itself into a story they'd been told. "You told me you didn't want to believe it," Vivian said to her daughter, very quietly. "You told me that, Kimberly. And this message says you were asking someone to build it 4 days before you ever showed it to me." Kimberly had no answer for that. I watched her physically shrink in her chair, the way people do when the version of themselves they've been performing for weeks finally runs out of road. Grace spoke next, laying out, in the same measured voice she must use in every difficult meeting, what she called the options on the table. "What's been done here constitutes forgery and could constitute defamation, depending on how the photograph and text messages were used or shown to others. Renata and Daniel have grounds to involve the police regarding the forged documents specifically, given Wade Pruitt's apparent involvement in creating them for the explicit purpose of deceiving a family member about a paternity matter. They also have grounds for a civil claim. Those options remain on the table." I let that sit for a moment before I spoke again, because I wanted them to understand, fully, that mercy was a choice I was making and not a default I owed them. "I'm not filing anything today," I said. "Not because what you did wasn't serious. It was. It's the kind of thing that could have ended my marriage if Daniel had been a different kind of man, and it's the kind of thing that could have followed my son his whole life if it had spread past that backyard the way you clearly wanted it to. I'm not filing today because I have 3 conditions, and if they're met, this stays a family matter instead of a legal one." Vivian nodded, barely, waiting. 1, I said. Kimberly issues a written retraction and apology, in a family group setting equal in size to the original accusation. The same people who were at that shower told the full truth, in a letter Kimberly writes herself, not a lawyer, not a publicist. 2. Grace redrafts the trust with a clause specifying that no distribution can be contested or delayed on the basis of unverified paternity claims. Any future paternity question must go through independent, court-recognized testing before it affects a single dollar. That protects every future grandchild in this family, including Tyler, from ever having this happen to them. 3. Wade Pruitt's involvement gets reported to the county, not as a criminal referral from me directly, but through Grace, documented, so that if he ever does this kind of work for anyone else, there's a record. Kimberly's eyes were wet, but she nodded before Vivian did. "I'll write it," she said quietly. "I'll write all of it." Her voice broke. "I'm sorry, Ren. I am. I got scared and I let Wade talk me into something I should have walked away from the second he suggested it." I looked at her for a long moment. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, the particular tired that comes after holding something heavy and precise for a very long time and finally getting to set it down. "I believe you're scared," I said. "I don't think you're a monster, Kimberly. I think you're a person who let fear write a story instead of asking for help. If you'd come to me about the mortgage, about Peter, about any of it, I would have helped you. Instead, you built a lie that could have destroyed my marriage and followed my son his whole life. Those are 2 very different things, and only one of them is forgivable in a single afternoon." Vivian's hands were folded on the table now, and when she finally spoke, her voice had none of its usual command left in it. "What do I need to do, Renata?" "You need to apologize to me the same way you accused me," I said. "In front of the same 40 people, at the next family gathering, in your own words, not because Grace drafted them for you. And you need to understand that I will never again let you host an event my son attends without me knowing exactly what you're planning to say." She nodded. It cost her visibly, and I let it cost her, because some debts are supposed to be expensive. "I want to tell you what happened in the months after, Because the confrontation is never really the end of a story like this, it's just the place where the truth finally outweighs the lie. My son, Owen, was born 6 weeks later, 7 pounds 2 ounces, with Daniel's exact stubborn chin, a detail that made the whole DNA report feel almost comically unnecessary in hindsight. Kimberly wrote her letter. She read it aloud at Thanksgiving that year, in front of the same extended family who'd been at the shower, her voice shaking through most of it, admitting everything, the forged photograph, Wade, the trust math, the fear underneath all of it. Nobody clapped when she finished. Nobody needed to. The room just quietly, visibly, believed her, which was worth more than applause. Grace redrafted the trust within a month. The new clause is 4 paragraphs long and, in my professional opinion, better legal protection than most families ever think to put in place before they need it. It specifies that any dispute over a beneficiary's parentage must be resolved through an accredited, court-recognized laboratory unconnected to any party with a financial interest in the outcome, with results binding within 30 days, and it explicitly bars any distribution from being delayed, reduced, or contested based on rumor, hearsay, or unverified documentation of any kind. Grace told me, once it was signed, that she planned to use an anonymized version of the language as a template for other clients going forward, not naming names, she assured me, just borrowing the architecture of a family that had learned the hard way what happens when money and biology are allowed to argue with each other unsupervised. I told her, only half joking, that if she ever wanted a case study on why paternity clauses matter, she could call me. Wade Pruitt lost 2 other clients once word got around Millbrook about what kind of retouching work he'd been willing to do, which is a smaller town's version of consequences, but a real one nonetheless. Grace's report to the county opened a formal inquiry into his business practices that, as far as I know, is still ongoing. Vivian gave her apology at Christmas, in front of the family, in her own words, exactly as agreed. It was stiff and formal and clearly practiced in a mirror beforehand, and I watched her get through it with her chin up the whole time, and I thought, that's the most honest thing this woman knows how to do, be disciplined about something even when it's costing her. I didn't fully forgive her that day. I don't know that I fully have, even now. But I let her hold my son for the first time that Christmas, and I watched her look down at his face, Daniel's chin, my eyes, and something in her expression cracked open in a way I hadn't seen from her in 4 years of marriage. He looks just like Daniel did, she said quietly, almost to herself. He is Daniel, I said. That was never actually the question, Vivian. The question was always whether you were willing to let the truth be inconvenient. She didn't answer that. I didn't need her to. Daniel and Kimberly are rebuilding something slower and more honest than what they had before, regular calls, an actual conversation about Peter's job search that turned, eventually, into Daniel helping Peter get an interview at a supplier Whitfield Construction worked with. I don't know if I'll ever be close with Kimberly the way I once thought I might be. But I believe her apology, and I believe she's spent every month since paying it forward in small, unglamorous ways, showing up, telling the truth even when it's unflattering, doing the slow work of being trustworthy again instead of just asking to be trusted. Dolores still works for Vivian, and I make a point now of stopping by with Owen every few weeks specifically to see her, because a woman who tells the truth when it costs her something deserves better than a quiet thank you and nothing else. I found out later that Vivian never once asked who'd told me about the kitchen conversation, which tells you something about the kind of reckoning she was actually willing to have with herself. Grace mentioned, almost in passing, that Vivian had asked her privately, weeks after our meeting, whether the new trust clause could be extended to cover every grandchild going forward, not just the ones already born. I don't know what that cost Vivian to ask for. I know it mattered. Owen is 9 months old now. He is Daniel's chin and my complete inability to sit still through a boring meeting, which Priya says is going to make him either a scientist or a menace, possibly both. He had his first birthday party planning conversation happen entirely without my input. Daniel booked the venue, ordered a cake shaped like a caterpillar, and invited exactly the people he wanted there, which is to say, everyone who showed up for us honestly during the worst 4 months of our marriage, and no one who didn't. Vivian is invited. Kimberly and Peter are invited, and Peter, 3 months into the job Daniel helped him find, will be bringing Tyler, who at 16 has started asking his Aunt Kimberly pointed, uncomfortable questions about what actually happened that spring, questions Kimberly has decided, to her credit, to answer honestly rather than smooth over. I think that alone tells you more about whether people can actually change than any apology letter ever could. I go back to work 3 days a week, and every single time I sit down at my desk and process a paternity case for someone else's family, I think about my own, and I am more careful, more patient, and more compassionate with the people on the other side of my results than I ever was before Owen was born. I know now, in a way I only used to know professionally, exactly what it costs a person to sit across a table from someone who's decided, before any evidence exists, exactly what story they want to be true. I still think, sometimes, about the 4 minutes Daniel spent in his mother's kitchen after I walked out of that shower with my mother on one arm and Priya on the other. I never asked him exactly what he said to her in those 4 minutes, and he's never volunteered it. I don't need to know. I know what he did in the 2 seconds before that, setting down a plate of petit fours so carefully it didn't make a sound, and standing up before anyone else in that yard had even finished being shocked. That's the part of this story that belongs only to us, and I intend to keep it that way. My name is Renata Holloway. I've spent 15 years telling people the truth about who they belong to, using nothing but blood, chemistry, and math that doesn't care who's in the room. I never once, in all those years, imagined I'd need my own tools turned on my own family. But I've learned this: love is not a rumor you're allowed to spread without proof, and family is not a courtroom where the loudest voice wins. The truth doesn't need volume. It just needs time, and someone patient enough to document it properly. If someone has ever tried to write your story for you, tried to make a lie true just by saying it loud enough, in front of enough people, I want you to hear this. You don't have to match their volume. You just have to be more patient than they are, and more accurate than they expect. That's the whole method. It's the only one I've ever needed. If this story reminded you of your own quiet strength, or of someone in your life who was underestimated right up until the moment they weren't, drop a comment and tell me about them. Tell me who stood up for you when it mattered, and what it cost them to do it, because I think those are the stories that deserve to be told just as much as the ones about the people who let us down. Subscribe to GM Mom Stories for more, and remember, the truth always tests clean, even when the people around you don't want it to.